Well, today we're going to be starting on the final chapter of your textbook, so we're really getting close to the end here. We're going to be going over chapter 12, which is all about observational and survey research. And we've kind of touched on some of these things before in previous chapters, especially earlier in the semester, but there are a few points that are worth elaborating on in a little bit more detail. So we're going to spend most of our time today just talking about observational research and giving some different examples of some classic observational studies. And then we'll talk more about survey construction and different characteristics of surveys a little bit later on this week. So, does anybody have any questions about anything before we get started on this stuff? All right. So let's take a quick look at our objectives. We'll begin by looking at two different types of observational research methods: naturalistic observation and participant observation, and we'll kind of compare those two and look at some examples. And then we'll spend a bit of time talking about some potential problematic issues with these observational research methods. These can be a really great way to get some rich data, but they have certain drawbacks compared to other types of research, like lab experiments. Right? So we'll be talking briefly about some control issues, some issues relating to different types of bias, particularly bias on the part of the observer. There's the problem of reactivity, which we've discussed a little bit before. And then we'll briefly talk about some ethical issues in observational research. So, as I said, we're going to start off by talking about naturalistic observation. So, does anybody know what this type of research usually involves, naturalistic observation?
Isn't it just standing and watching?
What's that?
Isn't it just basically like not making any, or not doing any treatment, just standing there watching, or trying to observe whatever behavior you're looking for?
Yeah, so you're observing behavior, but it's in a particular setting. Rebecca? Yeah.
Wouldn't a naturalistic observation be done where you don't do anything to the environment, like any manipulation whatsoever?
Right. There usually isn't any kind of a manipulation. Now we will talk about one example, or rather one exception to that rule toward the end of today's class, where the researcher creates a particular type of situation to try to elicit a particular type of behavior. But most of the time this involves describing behavior in a natural setting. So you're studying organisms, whether those are animals or people, in their natural environment. Right? So that's really the key thing about naturalistic observation, is that it occurs in some natural setting and not in the laboratory. Now, sometimes there are exceptions that are made to this for study of animals. Like if you're studying animals in the zoo, certain zoos will create what is a relatively accurate recreation of an organism's natural environment. So that'll be semi-naturalistic. But a lot of time it does actually involve going out into the real world. And it's very different from a lab study where you have a person reacting in this super controlled environment where there are no additional stimuli other than what the researcher has introduced. Now, a lot of times the observer in these studies will be hidden away. So an unobtrusive observer is a common method. Now, not necessarily hiding like this, although if you were studying animals in the wild, there are some methods that can be used, like actually hiding like this, observing from a long distance, or maybe using a hidden camera. Hidden cameras can also be used when doing observational research with people. And we'll talk about one example of one of those studies in a little while.
Wouldn't something like that still be more of a, wouldn't that cause, if you like had something like that obvious or something, wouldn't it cause unnatural behavior?
if it was noticed. Usually, I mean, I just put this up here as a little illustration, but it's usually much more subtle than that.
So like somebody drinking coffee in a coffee shop or something?
Yeah, it could be something as simple as that. Somebody drinking coffee, observing the other people in the shop. You know, somebody sitting at the mall, looking like they're reading a book when they're really observing interactions between the patrons at the mall. So, yeah, these are all different possibilities for observational research. Now, one alternative to the unobtrusive hidden observer is to have the observer present for an extended period of time and then assume that some degree of habituation has occurred. Does everybody know what habituation involves, what that means?
Living there?
Not exactly. Yeah.
They've gotten used to him, so they don't mind him.
Yeah. Your subject has basically gotten used to your presence, and so they either view you as one of the group, or they're not behaving differently in light of your presence. So a classic example of assumed habituation in observational research is Jane Goodall's work with apes. So she would go out into the wild and start living among the apes. And at first, they would react to her presence, and they'd start acting differently than they would normally. But then after she was around for a while, they just got used to having her there. And they would go back to their normal patterns of behavior, and that would allow her to really observe them up close and personal. This is also done with human beings. One of my committee members on my dissertation was a researcher by the name of Frank Marlowe, who, I may have mentioned him in here before. He studies the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, this hunter-gatherer tribe. And so he goes out there every year and spends several months interacting with them, observing their behavior, doing some different tests with them. And so at first, I'm sure that they were kind of surprised by his being there. They were acting differently when he was around. But since they have really gotten used to his presence, they view him as essentially part of the group. And so now he can go out there on a yearly basis, and it's assumed that they've become habituated to his presence. And so that would apply to some of the examples we were talking about before, like observing people in their natural environment. I had a colleague in grad school who was studying public display of affection, and he actually went out to one of the local night spots in town with some of his research assistants, and they acted like they were a group that was just out hanging out, but they were really watching the other people at the bar, looking to see when they would engage in public displays of affection, you know, hugging, kissing, any kind of touching out in public. And they were actually taking recordings of when these people were doing this, taking notes, and so it was just assumed that they were blending into that environment. Right? So any questions about this so far? Right. Now, a slightly different spin on naturalistic observation is participant observation. And the important difference here is that the experimenter actually joins the group that's being observed. So there's real interaction between the researcher and the people that they're studying. In naturalistic observation, there isn't usually any type of interaction. You're just observing. You might be blending in, and you might assume that your subjects think that you're part of their group or something like that, but you're not really interacting with them or influencing their behavior in any way. So, as you can imagine, this participant observation technique can be kind of tricky, especially when it comes to issues of bias. So